Hello, welcome to Stars, Cells, and God. My name's Jeff Zweerink. I'm joined in studio today with Hugh Ross. We're going to be talking about bioinspired designs and the cosmological constant. Hugh, it's good to have you here today. I know you've got a discovery on how we're learning from organisms out in the field, so I'll just go ahead and throw it to you for a discussion of bioinspired designs.
Yeah, sure. Well, the whole point is that we tend to achieve the best technology when we copy what God has designed.
He certainly made some really nice stuff for us to mimic.
He
hasn't
did,
he?
yeah. And so that kind of guides the development of our technology. And also we discover in the process that God's designs are always better than our designs. He creates at a higher level than we do. So just like they find, these motors inside the cell that look just like the motors we use in our automobiles, only his motors are better than our motors. But what I'm talking about today is the challenge of developing robotic hands. And, the human hand is quite an amazingly designed thing.
It really is.
A lot of papers been published on this. And typically...
It's even hard for AI to draw hands well. It's so remarkable.
It is. And up to this point, robotic hands have fallen into two categories. They're the rigid hands and they're the soft hands. And the rigid hands have the advantage that they're highly controllable.
Right.
And they can they can lift heavy objects. They can do things quickly. So, for example, if you need things to be done rapidly and precisely, you want rigid hands. But soft hands have the advantage that they can basically manipulate things well. They can kind of pick up things without damaging them because they have a soft touch to it. So
you see the challenge right there. We've got a mix of hard and soft in the way our hands work because they are very rigid and robust, but also do have a delicate nature to them.
They have a delicate nature to them. And this paper that got published in Science Advances just a few days ago is basically the first serious attempt to come up with a hybrid robotic hand that is both rigid and soft. So they get the advantages of these, rigid hands and the soft hands. But it required copying the human hand to a degree that's never been done before.
In what way?
Well, okay, the typical hard hands, they basically copy the skeleton in the human hand. And they make a point of looking carefully at the joints. I mean, the joints in your fingers are really quite complex.
Right.
So they found a way to mimic the knuckle joints in the human hand. And they quickly discovered that the fingers were a lot easier to mimic than the thumb. That was the hard part. And getting the thumb to oppose the fingers. I mean, it's one of the unique features of the human hand. You got the opposable thumb. And the test they had was, we're going to try to design a hand that can play a piano. And, now a rigid hand can play the piano, but you need that kind of soft touch to get the subtlety in the piano playing. And so that's what's been missing. So, but they said in order to be able to play the notes quickly and accurately, you need that hard skeletal feature. You need the joints to be just like what you see in the hand. But if you want to be able to duplicate, where you have this kind of a crashing sound on the piano, then kind of that soft, subtle feel, this is where you need to have, in addition to the rigidity of the human hand, you need to have that, soft, depressionable, because the human hand can be depressed a little bit. And so what they discovered is we not only have to mimic all the features in the skeleton of the human hand, we need to mimic the muscles and the tendons.
That's what I was wondering, yeah.
And the tendons turned out to be quite a challenge because what makes the human hand so capable and dexterous is that the tendons have a bit of rigidity to them, but they're not totally rigid. They have an elasticity to them. And so trying to come up with a way to mimic the tendons. And, of course, there's a lot of tendons in the human hand. And so to get them all there, and they're all different. They have different elasticity properties. And so they were carefully mimicking all this to get the tendons just right so they have just the right elasticity and just the right degree of rigidity or softness. And then they also had to mimic the muscles. And some muscles in your fingers that actually have that ability, okay, how can I pick up an egg and hold it firmly without crushing it so I get all this goo all over my hand? So that's one of the challenges, and that's where the muscles come in.
Well, it also seems like there's an additional, I don't know, problem or something else that's in there, is that not only are our fingers, just look at our fingers, there's a rigidity about them. So you can do very precise timed tasks. There's a flexibility in that you can push, but there's also a sensory capacity that allows you to tell what's going on in there. That would seem to be challenging too. I'm not even sure whether they even delved into that.
They dealt into that. The whole idea is that there's a nerve system in the human hand. And so our hand basically knows, okay, this is how I need to pick up this object, and I need to have a little soft touch here.
Right.
And too soft of a touch, I'm going to drop the egg. Too rigid of a touch, I'm going to crush the egg. So that was kind of the challenge. And then what if I want to be able to pick up an egg and twirl it around so it's facing in a different direction? That's something that's very difficult for a robot to do. And so this is where you have to have these, basically sensitizers that can figure out, okay, what am I dealing with? And to what degree is it rigid? Because if it's really rigid, I don't have to worry about the soft touch. But if it's like a sponge ball or a Nerf ball, that's a totally different idea than picking up a lacrosse ball. So you need sensitizers in the thing to be able to determine what kind of object am I dealing with, and how do I need to manipulate it so that I can turn it the right way and get it in the right configuration or put it in the right place.
Right.
These are all the challenges they were dealing with, and they were able to actually come up with a robotic hand that could play a piano, not like Liszt plays it, but they could do. They were coming close to what, say, an amateur piano player could do, where they would be able to get the hard notes and the soft notes, as well as getting the intricacy and the speed that's necessary, and also demonstrated that, hey, it can actually pick up objects like eggs or Nerf balls or lacrosse balls, and not only do that, but be able to manipulate them, which means you need to kind of have the hand design in such a way that you got the flexibility. And so,
right, yeah.
And that's the whole thing, is that with the soft hand, you got the flexibility, you also got the resilience. Resilience meaning it knows just how much pressure to put on the object that it's holding. Bottom line is, it gave the researchers a lot of appreciation for just the incredible design of the human hand, and gave them appreciation just how you compare the human hand with the hands of all other animals. Our hand is in a totally different category. So this actually, as I read the paper, they don't really talk about this in the paper, but as I read through the paper, it says this actually gives us another piece of evidence for human exceptionalism. In their attempt to mimic the human hand, and all they had to go through was basically demonstrating the human hand has features that a cat paw doesn't have, or a chimpanzee hand doesn't have, and how this is all necessary for us to develop the technology that we have. And something that's always impressed me, Jeff, is that, one of the arguments for God designing the human body, he seemed to anticipate that there would come a time after tens of thousands of years of human development where we would need to all be able to type 100 words a minute accurately. I mean, you didn't need that when people were basically sitting around a campfire, cooking their food and telling stories to one another. But it's like, millennia later, suddenly we need to have the whole human population able to type accurately at 100 words a minute, or to be able to develop the skills where they could, say, play, the Brandenburg concertos on a guitar. That's quite a challenge to do, but people have done it. Or to play a Liszt piano concerto. I mean, nobody had a need for that 30,000 years ago. And it's like God anticipated. So
No, you're right. I think there's part of that you could argue that we've developed that ability, or we do that because that's what our bodies have the capacity to do. But I think your point you're making is very profound there, in that I think you could make a hand that could play the piano better than humans. I don't see any reason why we couldn't do that. But the same hand that we have that allows us to play the piano allows us to touch somebody gently, to break through a wall. The diversity, the range of what our hand operates in is phenomenal. And I see that just kind of repeatedly throughout life, that it's not that it does one thing well, it's that in this very potentially hostile, potentially benign environments, life works really, really well.
Well, for example, you made the comment we could actually design a robotic hand that could play the piano better than we do. I would say it could be designed where it could play a faster piece than we could do. Because, to use the example of a Liszt piano concerto, people are saying the only person that can play it is Liszt. Because the speed with which you've got to go is just at the very limit of what the human hand can do. Mm-hmm. But we could develop a robotic hand that could actually play pieces that have a faster pace than even a Liszt piano concerto, but it wouldn't have that soft touch to be able to give all the emotional that you're able to put into the piece.
Well, but it does seem to me, if you just say, all right, I'm just going to focus on the piano, you can now design the ability the hand has to have is much less than what the hand can actually do. You can hit the notes. You've got flexibility in how to do that. But in order to play it as well or better, I think, you put all the soft tissue on there. To do that, that mechanical hand can now no longer pick up the egg and rotate it and look at it. Because,
without breaking it.
It's like putting everything together is really hard. And that's what's
right.
really impressive about the human hand and the human eye, and just the way bacteria work and.
Another good example is I've run into skeptics, non-Christian skeptics, that says the human backbone is a terrible design. Mm-hmm. We could do way better. And I said, well, yeah, you're right. We could design a backbone that would enable us to stand a lot longer than what normal human beings can stand. But our backbone enables us to stand for a relatively long period of time, to sit at a desk, which I think is probably the most challenging thing for a backbone,
right.
To be able to sit at a desk for hours and hours, to be able to run all day long. It's one of the unique things of the human body, mm-hmm. is that other animals can run faster than us, but we seem to have endurance that the other animals don't have. And so our backbone enables us to run fast for a short period of time and be able to do a 100-mile-an-hour run nonstop. We can do all that. So it's a combination of everything we can do. And that's the thing about the human hand I think you're bringing out, is the fact that it can do so many diverse things. And to sustain our technology, the human hand must be able to do all those mm-hmm. diverse things. And it's like our Creator anticipated the wide diversity of things that we would want to do with our hands.
Right.
So
that's just a little bit of diversion from that. But I have wondered, as I was starting to think about AI and, just recognizing that AI kind of has this property that once it learns to do something, it always gets better. So, with chess, when it took AIs a long time to learn how to play at a human level, but once it did, they're just better. We don't play AIs anymore because they're just better. But I've often wondered if there's an argument, an apologetic argument, in that you can make things that might think faster. You can make things that might run faster. You can make things that might last longer or whatever. But if you're going to get what humans do, the full suite of what humans do, that we can run, we can think, we can rest, we can be physical, we can be emotional, when you put all of that together, and we do it on a diet that is either enjoyable, we can eat and self-nourish and do all that. When you put all of that package together, the only way you're going to get all that is to basically replicate humans.
Yeah.
That you can swap one of those out and say, we're not going to do it, and then you can make something better. But you haven't made it better. You've just you've had a trade-off there. And so you're no longer talking about something that's human. And I've wondered if there's an apologetic argument in there for God somehow, and I haven't figured out how to articulate
Well,
it yet, but it
the
seems
energy
intriguing.
efficiency, because I mean,
Yeah.
some of the amazing things that AI systems do, you look at all the megawatts of electricity that
absolutely.
are necessary to make it happen, and a human does relatively the same thing by eating one hamburger.
I know, yeah. And the brain is a relatively small thing, and it's remarkably endurable that it lasts at least 70,
Well,
80, 90 years
I think
typically
that
without a lot of problems.
That makes the point I stated at the beginning, is that we come up with the best technology and we copy God's designs, but we're always humbled by the fact that his designs are always better than our designs, no matter what we achieve. On the other hand, I think this robotic hand they came up with that has this hybrid, soft and rigid capabilities, maybe it'll be able to play very complex piano pieces nonstop for 10 hours, whereas a human would need a break after an hour or two.
That is fair. That is fair. No, I think it's a fantastic point. I also, I don't ever want to give the impression it's like, oh, well, this is impressive work. I mean, what humans come up with and study is pretty remarkable.
Well, given the fact that engineers have been working on robotic hands literally for decades, and it's taken this long to be able to come up with a hybrid, soft, rigid hand.
Right.
And I'm also excited about the applications. I mean, a few years ago, actually quite a few years ago, 15 years ago, I had robotic surgery done on me. And this robot basically did all the surgery.
Right.
But I'm looking at this thing saying, robotic surgery could be exponentially more effective using these kinds of robotic hands that are simultaneously rigid and soft, that can be controlled. And, this really has incredible benefits. I remember the surgery I had. I was on the operating table. The nearest human being was 35 feet away. And so that meant that there was virtually zero risk of infection.
Right.
Because there was no human around that could possibly infect me. And then also the computer-controlled robotic surgeon, but also realizing this could enable much more robotic surgeries than what's possible now. Because right now it's limited to what kind of surgeries you can do with a robot. But I think this is going to, so in that sense, I think there's going to be some real health payoffs from this. And
certainly seems
who else
like it,
knows? Maybe we can have robotic hands controlling our cars. I don't know.
I don't know. I still like driving cars. That's the problem. I know people want to move towards cars, but there's something very relaxing about being able. I just enjoy driving. I would hate to give up.
Well, I also think of people who like to knit and crochet.
Yeah.
It's like, we could develop a robot that can do it better, but people actually like to do these kinds of things.
Yeah.
So
there's something more than just accomplishing the task that goes on in there, and I have there's something more there that I think we need to think about carefully. So,
but hey, if we can save lives, go for it.
I think that's a good point. So,
okay.
Well, good. I'd like to transitioning to a discussion. We had a discussion a few episodes ago about the cosmological constant, particularly looking at universes where the cosmological constant could be larger or smaller. And it ended up generating a discussion about fine-tuning and design and how do we think about that.
And Jeff, maybe we need to talk a little bit. What do you mean by the cosmological constant?
I'll get to that in a second. So, but because one of the things, and I just kind of a little bit of outline of where I want to go is I want to talk just about fine-tuning and how do we argue for it? Is that evidence for God? Is it something that's compelling evidence? Can we be confident that it's there? And, talk about, I think there's a lot of evidence, or there's a lot of reason to think that if God created the universe for a purpose, we're going to see fine-tuning and design in it. And so, just kind of flesh out how that is. And I want to move on and talk about what the cosmological constant is, how the fine-tuning shows up with the cosmological constant, because it shows up a little differently there in the way we often talk about it. There's another discussion about inflation and the mass density that's going to be related to that. We'll talk about why we think the cosmological constant might be different in other universes, and that's related to unification. Talk about what it means to have a habitable universe, and then just kind of end with how do people receive fine-tuning arguments? So that's kind of the flow of where I want to go.
Yeah,
with it.
and to put it in historical context, the fine-tuning argument has been the go-to scientific evidence for God for at least the past 2 millennia. So it's been around a long time.
Well, I don't know that you could argue that's a scientific argument, but and that's where I think it's important. There's fine-tuning, but fine-tuning actually points to design or purpose.
Yes.
And so the teleological argument has been around for a long time. The fine-tuning argument seems to be a way to make a teleological argument. And
Right.
and that's one where scientifically we can come in and weigh. And I think that's important to recognize, because as I've been wrestling with fine-tuning arguments, my original impression kind of was, oh, fine-tuning arguments, that's where it's, you can put a ratio on it. It's a specific way of characterizing it with fractions and ratios. And what I recognize is that how that plays out can change, but just because the ratio, or I may find an explanation for that particular way of characterizing it, doesn't mean that the design has gone. It just means that the way I was articulating the teleological argument just has to change a little bit.
Well, I've seen that even 40 years ago in Locke's Reasons to Believe, is there's ways to say, hey, I can minimize the fine-tuning here. The fine-tuning moves. And I think the
Right.
more we learn about science, the more we see the movement of the fine-tuning and the more complex features we see in the fine-tuning.
Right.
And that in itself is an apologetic argument. If God is behind it, that's exactly what you'd expect to discover as you research fine-tuning.
Well, and I think, part of, to me, or one of the things that says to me that this is an argument that's not going away, even if it may shift in its details. I was having a discussion with Rabbi Eli Fader and Aaron Zimmer a couple of Star Cells and God episodes ago, where we were talking about fine-tuning in the multiverse. And I thought they just had a great way of saying it. One of the things that they said was, okay, when we look at our model of the universe, Big Bang cosmology, standard model of particle physics, very powerful description of things, but yet there are these numbers that are just injected in. They're just put in. And they look fine-tuned in the sense that if they were larger or smaller, you get universes that don't seem to be able to support life. And so, it's a sign of fine-tuning there. And so scientists were thought, well, we don't like that these numbers are just put in and fine-tuned. As we move forward, we're going to find ways of explaining why they are. The theory itself will tell us what they are. And so we're going to move away from having this, it looks like they're designed type numbers. And in the process of doing that, the multiverse came in there and said, the multiverse, well, all of these fine-tuned numbers, the reason why you've got the one planet is there's just a large enough number of them out there. And so even though it's a very rare thing, the multiverse, it's going to happen somewhere, and we have to be where it is. And so it seems like it got rid of that. And in a very real sense, it seems like, so you throw the multiverse at this and all the fine-tuning goes away, is what it looked like initially. But in reality, when you step back and say, all right, now let's look at the multiverse and how that plays out, what the two rabbis were pointing out is that now in the multiverse, you now have to consider, you're going to have to ask the question, does it look like we're normal and ordinary, or do we look unusual in some sense? Because that's kind of what the fine-tuning is pointing, is like, this looks unusual. And it turns out in the multiverse, in the same way there were these numbers that had to be injected, with the multiverse, you have to choose certain kinds of measures. You still end up hand-picking or arbitrarily choosing things in a way that looks unusual or unnatural. And so even though it looked like we explained the fine-tuning by using the multiverse still has the fine-tuning. And that kind of goes to your point that the fine-tuning doesn't ever really disappear. It just kind of moves around where it's being talked about.
Yeah, and the case with the universe, we have an observable database of one. Where I think we can come up with a good analogy, yes, we only have one universe we can observe, but look at the 2 trillion galaxies we get to observe. And so it's hard to make a statistical argument when you have only one database.
Fair point.
You can't. But you can with 2 trillion galaxies. You can with 10 to the 25 planets, and just say, okay, does our planet look unusual compared to the other 10 to the 25? We can't see them all, of course, but we can see a good number of them.
Well,
or the
but
stars.
that was what was interesting about the discussion we were having, and we'll kind of move on to what the cosmological constant is, and is that it does seem like there are ways you can make statistical arguments about does what we see in our universe look ordinary or usual, or does it look fine-tuned? And that's what they were looking at, saying, given that we could, in the multiverse, we expect different parts of the multiverse to have different cosmological constants, in the ones where there are life, what values are they going to see? And then we ask, does what we measure fit well in that distribution? Does it look ordinary? And what they came out with in the paper, and if you go back and look at that past episode, was that the most expected value of the cosmological constant that people would measure would be about 100 to 500 times larger than what we do. So even though we can only measure our universe, when you now say, all right, let's study what might the multiverse look like, given that there are observers, even in that sense, our value for the cosmological constant looked unusual. So even though we can't measure what's out there, we still can make a statistical or fine-tuning argument.
We can on the assumption that the universe actually has observers in it.
No, that's fair,
Yeah.
but I think that's a great caveat to keep in mind with all of this, is that we are now doing something where when we're looking at the trillion galaxies, we're actually making measurements of what really exists and what our telescopes measure. Here we're doing simulations of what we think might be out there, and that is a big distinction. I think that's important to point out.
Okay.
So cosmological constant. This was, it goes by space energy density, dark energy. It's just basically this idea or measurement that we found is that when we look at the expansion of the universe, somewhere in the 5 to 9 billion years ago range, the expansion started accelerating instead of slowing down. And the most natural, so there's this dark energy. You can call it a cosmological constant, call it space energy density. I'm just going to call it the cosmological constant for the rest of the podcast. Use those terms interchangeably. And it's just a way of quantifying and saying how much energy or how much energy density is there in this cosmological constant that drives the expansion of the universe. And we can calculate how much it is. And, in more, normal units, it's about 10 to the minus 10 ergs per cubic centimeter. That's the density of energy that it requires to do that. And it's really just this property of space, or it's what the cosmological constant does is that as space grows, it wants to grow faster. That's the simplest explanation of it. And so now the question is, okay, so we have this cosmological constant. The way it's often characterized is that it's fine-tuned to 1 part in 10 to the 120. And why I think part of why I wanted to do this is that with a lot of the fine-tuning arguments that have been used, you've talked about finding the right kind of planet, and you say it's got to be this kind of planet because if this planet was larger, planet was smaller. If it changed by whatever 1 part in whatever, then you get something that's not inhabitable. That's not where this 10 to the 120 comes. And I think, we even have one book, we were talking about this the other day, that I think Why the Universe is the Way It Is, has it, that it says it that way, that if it changes by 1 part in 10 to the 120, you get a universe without life. Although right below that, it points to an appendix where it describes it properly. But where the fine-tuning shows up, this factor of 10 to the 120, is not that if you change it by a little bit, you get an uninhabitable universe. It's that given what we know about the universe, we can calculate what we expect the cosmological constant to be and what we measure it to be, and what we expect it to be is about 120 orders of magnitude larger than what we measure it to be.
Yeah.
And what that means, and without going into all the details of it, you would expect contributions to the cosmological constant from where the electroweak symmetry breaks, from where quantum chromodynamics breaks.
Basically talking about the history of the universe.
Yes, exactly.
This is where the fine-tuning shows up.
Yeah, so you've got where quantum gravity comes in, you would expect a contribution there. And you can quantify the amount of energy scale at which those contributions come. And what we measure is this really, really tiny amount of cosmological constant. But all of the contributions we can think that would make, or all of the things that would contribute to it, have energies that are enormously larger. And I haven't sat down to work out the numbers, but you can imagine you go out into a patch of the ocean and you're throwing in boulders and mountains and continents into the ocean there, and now you go out and measure it afterwards, and it's smoothed down to the atomic level. So you're throwing in these huge things, and you're getting out this really smooth down at the atomic level. That's kind of what's going on here. Is we're with the cosmological constant, we're throwing in contributions from these enormous quantities, and somehow they just all ridiculously cancel out and give this ridiculously small
It's
value.
the cancellation factor.
Exactly,
Because
yes.
you got these huge quantities that happen to almost perfectly balance one another. Not perfectly balanced, because that would give you zero.
Exactly.
But they cancel one another out to such a degree that you get exactly what you need to have a history of the universe so that life can exist in it.
Or at least that something down in this, maybe it could grow by a factor of 10 or 100,
Right.
But it's nowhere near this enormous value, which is where you would expect it.
Right.
And I think that's just important to recognize or remember or understand where that is, because I know when people come at me with arguments, say, hey, I've got an argument. This one argument will destroy the Bible, destroy Christianity, because it'll show that Christianity can't exist. One, I'm like, all right, there's too much weight of evidence that Scripture is correct. I'm hard-pressed to think you're going to throw one piece of evidence at me and show me that Christianity's wrong. But if that person comes in and says something that I know is just ludicrous, or shows that they don't understand what the Bible says, I'm not going to listen to them. And that's why I think it's important to understand where the fine-tuning comes in, because if you're talking to scientific people, if you don't talk with scientific credibility, they're rightfully going to say, hey, you're not worth listening to.
Jeff, I see this as one example. I mean, I think the title we had on that appendix is Where is the Fine-Tuning?
Yes, it is.
And it's like, you could use that in a lot of different areas in the fine-tuning argument. It's the fine-tuning is real. Exactly where it exists and how it's expressed, that's not always easy to nail down.
Well, and I think that's a great point, because when I first started doing apologetics, kind of my thought was, in my arrogance, if you will, is that if I just find those apologetic arguments, get them lined up, figure out the strongest ones, and 1 part in 10 to the 60, that's irrefutable, and you just kind of line them up, then I've got this airtight case that I can present to people, and they're either going to become a Christian or they're irrational. That was, if I'm candid, that's what my thought process was. And what I've just come to appreciate is that I don't think there is a airtight, compelling case for Christianity, because God hasn't designed it that way. I mean, if there were ever an airtight, compelling case for Christianity, it would have been Jesus walking on the earth. And you've got people who knew Jesus who chose to reject him anyway. So for whatever reason, God has set up the world so that there's not an airtight, compelling case for him.
Notice all the disciples got to see Jesus walking on top of the Sea of Galilee, and one of them decided to reject him.
Yeah, exactly. No, I think so. So this isn't a matter of building an airtight, compelling case. And I do want to just make a quick point. I think there's abundant evidence for the truth of Christianity. I just don't think the case is so strong that it compels somebody to believe. And I think God has set it up that way. Or at least when I read Scripture, that seems to be the way God has set it up.
Well, I think you're also making the point, Jeff, that it's an issue when you focus on, say, 1, 2, or 3 arguments. Mm-hmm. As our friends and our philosophers here at Reasons Believe have pointed out, the way you argue for the Christian faith is accumulative evidence.
Right.
And you can move some of the evidence from one area to another area, but if you look at the cumulative whole, that's the case where we see growing evidence. The evidence is always increased for the Christian faith. It's never decreased. But if you actually pick it apart, and I remember when I was not yet a believer, I was reading Immanuel Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. And what he did is he basically took the cosmological argument for God, broke it up into 9 pieces, and said that each individual piece is inadequate to argue for the existence of God. And therefore, we don't really have a scientific case for God. But what he was ignoring or trying to fool people with he did not destroy the cumulative case. He basically showed that break it into 9 little pieces. Each individual piece is inadequate, but if I put all 9 together, I salvage the cosmological argument.
And I think that's a powerful point. And kind of what I would argue is that each of these different fine-tuning arguments, the cosmological argument, I kind of look at them as tools to have in my toolbox. That if my argument is, well, I need to be able to argue the cosmological constant is fine-tuned, well, I could talk to someone who either just isn't interested in that, who doesn't think it's I know my response is if I were a skeptic to it. And so if that's the only thing I have, then my toolbox is inadequate. But if I have a number of things I can talk about, now I'm looking to say, what are you interested in talking about? What can I bring that might be persuasive to you, rather than I've got this thing that you can't refute? It's just a different way of approaching it. For me, it helped me, as I recognized that, it gave me a way to say, I don't have to have this airtight argument. I need to have good scientific knowledge of what's going on and be able to go talk to people and meet them where they are and have discussions about them. It took it away from the argument to thinking about the person.
Yeah, it does. And recognize every individual is different.
Yes.
Therefore, there will be no silver bullet that works in every case.
Right.
That was one of my motivations in launching Reasons to Believe. I saw all these evangelistic organizations who are basically using a single tool. A silver bullet. They told you this is going to work on every non-Christian you meet. It doesn't. That's
right.
why you need a tool chest,
right.
a wide variety.
Yeah.
And I think where this is actually being played out in the cosmological constant, there's observations of the expansion of the universe indicating that maybe dark energy is not governed by a single constant, but maybe by 2 or 3 constants.
Yeah. That's a great point. So even if we were to just say, hey, we've got this fine tuning, there may be something more to this picture that we don't know yet.
Yeah, in which case we may be looking at 3 fine tuning, not just 1 fine tuning, if there's multiple constants involved.
Right.
And
I would want to say something, I think that idea that there's more to this than what we know is important to keep in mind, because I want to hearken back to another fine tuning, one of the really powerful fine-tuning arguments. And this was, go back 30, 40 years ago, you've got the mass density of the universe. So we know that the universe is expanding. And if it expands too quickly, the stuff in the universe doesn't clump up and you don't get stars. You just end up with this big
lot of gas.
A lot of gas throughout the universe. And if it expands too slowly, the clumping is too rapid, and you end up with black holes and stuff. Again, a galaxy where you're not going to have the stars where life can exist. And given the way Big Bang cosmology developed, you could show that if the mass density were to change by 1 part in 10 to the 60, very early in the universe, you get a universe that is not habitable. So it is one of those, if it changes by just a little bit, 1 part in 10 to the 60, you get a universe that's not habitable.
But it's assuming that the only thing governing the expansion of the universe is mass. What if there's something else that's involved?
Well, I think that's another good point to bring in there. But let's just leave it at that, because that's all we knew at the time, was that there was mass. But so the mass density did need to be incredibly fine-tuned. But at the same point in time, there was this theory of inflation that was coming about. And one of the things that, as people studied what is the mass density of the universe, and they're looking at inflation, what they realized is that it didn't matter what the inflation or the density of the mass density of the universe started with. Once inflation came in, once inflation happened, it drove the density of the universe exquisitely close to what it had to be. So you could argue that inflation did solve the mass density fine-tuning. And so if you've got this one really powerful argument, now you've got a solution to it. So it could be in our study of the cosmological constant, we actually find some mechanism that drives it to the value that we see. And what we thought was fine-tuning turns out to be just a natural consequence of one of the processes in there. But to your point, it doesn't really it didn't really get rid of the fine tuning.
It just moved it.
It actually moved it into, we think inflation, oh, that's not fine. Inflation actually turns out to be really highly fine tuned in order to get a universe something that looks like ours. So part of what, I think one thing to recognize in there, and my colleague Mike Strauss commented this, and I thought it was a really good insight, is, let's go out and take a mower. If you ever tried to get gas in a mower, this may be a too old of an analogy, but I remember trying to dump gas in the mower, and you'd open your gas can up and try and pour it, and it'd slosh and it'd get all over. And you had to be really careful and fine-tune things so that the gas got in there. I grew a little bit older, and I could take this thing called a funnel and put it in there. And now, regardless of how I glugged the gas out, it went into the gas can. And you say, wait, the funnel solved the fine-tuning. No, it really didn't. The funnel just explains, or it now ensures that the fine-tuning happens.
Yes.
And so...
And the funnel has to be fine-tuned. Yeah.
It's exactly. Just because we find an explanation for the fine-tuning doesn't mean the fine-tuning is gone. It still needed to be that value. We've just now found the mechanism that drives it to that value. That doesn't make it anything less remarkable that it had to be that value in the first place.
Yeah. And kind of where I see the frontier, Jeff, is that, we're trying to determine what kind of inflation happened in the early history of the universe. And it's kind of like the cosmological constant. For a long time, people thought it's a simple inflation that basically explains everything. The latest measurements we got from the South Pole are basically saying we can now definitively conclude it's not simple inflation. Mm-hmm. It's a complex inflation. Which means, hey, there's an opportunity here to discover fine-tuning we never saw before. And likewise with the dark energy. Maybe it's not governed by a single constant. Mm-hmm. One thing I'm wondering about it, too, we may actually discover that it's really crucial to have advanced life in the universe, that the universe expand at different rates at different times in cosmic history.
That wouldn't surprise me either, yeah.
We're talking something that's at a level of a 1% difference.
Right.
Or even less between the expansion rate of the early universe and the later universe. But it's like we now have the technology to be able to explore those very subtle, and it leads to a theoretical question. Why does the universe have to expand at a slightly more rapid rate now than it did in the past? Is there something we're not seeing here? And so it's kind of like the principle in science. When you see something anomalous, there's an opportunity to dig deeper.
Yes.
And every time we dig deeper, we find more evidence for what the Bible says about the universe and God's creation.
Well, and I think that sort of mindset actually goes a long way towards responding to a common objection. I think it's wrongly stated, but Christians do kind of have this flavor of being a little skeptical, a little tentative about science in general, if you will. And almost kind of the Bible said it, I don't have to pursue anymore. But what you're saying is like, this is interesting. We've got this thing that we can't explain. And instead of being scared or worried about it, it's like, if God really created the universe, the more we study, the more we're going to find his fingerprints in it. And I have just personally witnessed that in the last 30 years as I've been trained as a scientist and doing apologetics work, that places where I thought, ooh, that might show that God doesn't exist, as I investigated, it's like, oh, no, this is actually far more abundant evidence than I could have imagined if things had stayed at the simple picture as I imagined them in the first place.
Well, one thing I think we can say for certain about the record of nature, it's more complex than we think it is.
Amen. Well, oddly enough, Scripture has that same same feature to it. So.
Well, the good news, it means that you and I will never be unemployed as astrophysicists because we're never going to get to the point where we solve all the problems. And likewise,
now, we may get AIs that can do it better than us, and that's going to put us out of. No, I'm joking.
No.
That's a different topic.
We still need to figure out how to make the AIs do it.
Fair point. No, that was a couple of final comments. I do think it's important to recognize at least the landscape in which we live, because so I talked about how inflation solved the mass density fine tuning, and this is part of one of the things that we address in the appendix of why the universe is the way it is that where inflation seemed to solve the fine tuning of the mass density, I think it shifted the fine-tuning into the inflationary mechanism itself, but it
Right.
also revealed a different kind of fine-tuning. And this is where the cosmological constant comes into play. Because when we were looking at the expansion of the universe in the 80s and 90s, all we had was the mass density. That was the only thing that affected the expansion of the universe. Well, when inflation happens, what we know is that the geometry of the universe ends up flat. But astronomers had known for decades that when we account for all of the mass that could possibly be, you only get about 30% of what you need to make a flat universe. And so something else must be there to make a flat universe. Well, that's right about the time we discovered the accelerating expansion of the universe, which means there's this cosmological constant. And so even though inflation, quote unquote, solved the 10 to the 60, 1 part in 10 to the 60 fine-tuning of the mass density, it shifted the fine-tuning into the inflation, the mechanism of inflation itself, and it revealed this other type of fine-tuning that we didn't even know about in the first, and that's the cosmological constant, which is so much smaller than what we expect it to be.
Yeah, and I'll give you another historical context here. We didn't really discover dark energy until 1998 or 1999.
Mm-hmm.
But I remember hearing a lecture in 1969 from a cosmologist who basically said, in order for the universe to actually have cosmologists like us, the universe has to have a flat geometry. To have a flat geometry, there's got to be a space energy density. So they concluded even back in 1969, this is the way the universe has got to be. And he basically said, we have no hope of ever discovering this, because the assumption was we had never developed the telescope technology to be able to discover it. But he says, I can guarantee, I'm willing to bet any amount you want, that this space energy density is a dominant component of the universe, because otherwise I wouldn't be here giving the lecture.
Oh, that's funny. So.
Yeah, it is.
Well, and it turned out to be right.
Turned out to be right, yeah.
Now, there is another feature or another aspect of this that I'm going to make what may seem like a controversial statement, but I think it's true, and so we need to deal with it. So, as I've mentioned, inflation solves the fine-tuning of the mass energy energy density. Inflation is fine-tuned in and of itself. I think that's not a controversial statement. Inflation also drove us to recognize the cosmological constants, that's there, and we see fine-tuning in that. Another consequence of inflation is that we live in a multiverse. If you read my booklet, Who's Afraid of the Multiverse, there's the level 1 multiverse, the level 2 multiverse. It is a generic statement that if inflation happened, we live in a level 1 multiverse. And that means what we see is a very small part of what it is that exists. And there's a question of how big is it does it exist?
Well, we know it's at least quite a bit bigger than what we see.
And most scientists or most cosmologists actually think it's spatially infinite. And so that's, rankles all sorts of feathers when we start talking about actually spatial infinite things existing. But nonetheless, it is far larger than what we can see, not just a little bit, minimum of 1,000 times larger and probably significantly more vast than that. The other probably more controversial part of that statement is scientists have spent a long time figuring out how do you get inflation to work. And almost every mechanism that actually makes inflation work produces a level 2 multiverse. So I would actually argue not only do we live in a level 1 multiverse, we probably live in a level 2 multiverse as well. And so now we do have to take into account these considerations of what might the multiverse look like, because if that's the scenario we live in, that we live in a level 2 multiverse, now you have to ask the question, does that solve the fine-tuning of why is the electromagnetic constant the strength that it is? Because given the way we understand physics, a lot of the values we see are values, so the strength of the electromagnetic constant, even the speed of light, these sorts of things result from our universe starting in this incredibly hot, dense state, hot, dense, symmetric state. And as it decays, symmetry breakings give us the electromagnetic force, the electroweak force, the strong nuclear force. Those could have happened in different ways, and you get different
could
constants.
have happened at different times, which would really mess things up. Yeah.
But now the multiverse may provide a mechanism for explaining why do we see all the constants we do, because the other feature, the other fact that must be taken into account is that whatever universe we live in must have values conducive to us living here. And so that means that, at least at a first glance, the multiverse does solve a lot of, or explain a lot of those fine-tunings. Now, I think when it comes down to it, the multiverse is every bit as fine-tuned, or shows evidence of design and teleology in its fine-tuning, as does any of these other things. But the argument for it is very different. And so I do think, being as though most cosmologists think we live in a multiverse, and that's increasingly true the younger the cosmologist is, I think, this is something as apologists we need to be well equipped to deal with. And so I think it's important to do.
Yeah. Yeah, and Leonard Susskind has basically been, in the last few years, telling all of his colleagues, hey, we can't use the multiverse to argue there is no God. We have to abandon that whole point. And, he made an interesting point that if you actually appeal to a level 3 multiverse, that explains literally everything. If you're explaining everything, it explains nothing. Therefore, this has no scientific value. We have to stop using this as an argument against the existence of God. It doesn't work.
No, that's a great point. And I would actually encourage, when I was doing the podcast, The Star Cells and God, with Ellie Fader and Aaron Zimmer, two rabbis, that one way of articulating that came out very clearly in that podcast. So I'd encourage people to go investigate that a little bit more. But I want to just throw out one last comment to get your thoughts on it, because when you see 1 part 10 to the 60, 1 part, that it's 120 orders of magnitude too small, or these numbers that they're almost kind of overwhelming, how could you possibly think otherwise type numbers, if you will. One of the things that I've come to appreciate is that, as a scientist, very often when I see ridiculous-looking things, and I would put, the mass density is fine-tuned to 1 part in 10 to the 160, that's ridiculous, and that it's mind-bogglingly inconceivable, if you will. That very often a scientist has, by experience, been taught that where you see stuff like that, that means you don't understand things well. And so there is a very real part of me that when I see those really large numbers, I originally thought, these are strong arguments I can use. And I think they are strong arguments. But I also recognize that I need to be aware that I'm not arguing by amplifying the ignorance, because I could very easily be a skeptic who would say, okay, yeah, we've got these numbers. That just means we don't have everything here. So why are we making arguments for God about stuff where we know we clearly don't know everything that's going on, because these numbers tell us that we don't know what's going on? I'm curious, how would you respond to that?
Well, I mean, this is a debate I often see between observational astronomers and theoretical astronomers, where the theoreticians will say, hey, we can speculate X. But it's like, do you have any observational evidence for your speculation? No, but I think it's an interesting idea. And so I would say we have to argue for God's existence or non-existence based on what we do know, not what we don't know, because there's always stuff we don't know.
So if the skeptic would come back and respond, yes, the fact that this says 10 to the 120 too large, or we see a fine-tuning of 10 to the 60, that what we know is that tells us we don't know what's going on here. So why are you using that as an argument for God?
Yeah, well, basically to say, hey, what I've noticed about people who are non-theists, when they respond to the anthropic principle, they stay at the level of the universe, because there we have a data size of 1.
Okay.
And I find it that how you reach those folks, get them away from the universe to smaller size scales, and basically demonstrate no matter what size scale you look at, you see observational evidence for extraordinary fine-tuning. And once you get away from the universe to smaller size scales, suddenly your database is no longer 1. It's very large numbers.
Okay, so there's so that's really going in and saying, okay, there's more tools in my tool belt than just this one number. Hey, let's look at some of this. I am gonna come back and just push a little more here, just because this is a fun discussion. So if somebody says, okay, hey, but you're now shifting the conversation. It's like you're diverting. Why are you using this number here?
Why am I diverting is because okay, we're making a statistical argument here. You can't make a statistical argument, at least not very effectively, where you got a small database. I mean, if we're talking 100 or less, what's the significance? How can you argue that something is unusual where you only have, say, 12 items in the database?
Okay. So so the argument being, if I say, okay, our universe has a cosmological constant that is 120 orders of magnitude smaller than what we expect. You're saying, yeah, you're correct. There's not a statistical argument we can make, but we can look and say something's really weird here. But you're right. Okay, at some level, there's an ignorance. We don't know what's going on here, but let's look over here. Is that basically what you're saying?
That's basically it, and basically saying, okay, if we were to go back 40 years ago, we could only identify 17 features of the universe and the laws of physics that displayed extraordinary fine-tuning. What does that list look like today? Well, the list has grown to nearly 200. So it's like we're adding more and more fine-tuned elements, basically making the point, yeah, you can move the fine-tuning, but notice, as we learn more about the universe, we're discovering more and more features of the universe and the laws of physics that appear to be fine-tuned. So even though we're dealing with a database of one, the evidences for fine-tuning seem to be moving up. They're not going down. I would say the non-theists would have a case if we say, oh, we started with 17, today we only have 11. It's like, maybe I need to call into question whether this is really fine-tuned. But the fact that it's up to 200, that tells me something.
I think that's an important point, because I did give one example where it seems like, okay, inflation solves the mass density fine-tuning, and it is one of those big numbers that it solves, if you will. So that's a little bit, carries more weight. But that's one of the few examples where a lot of those fine-tuned numbers where we found an explanation for it, and even that didn't really move. It just moved the fine-tuning around. Your point is very well stated, in that the more we study, that number of where we see the fine-tuning seems to be growing over time, not getting smaller.
Yes, and also when we begin to drill down and say, okay, if the universe has no personal God that's fine-tuning everything and designing everything. I saw this in the mid-1990s. As we discover planets, we're going to find a whole bunch that are just like the planets in our solar system. Because the assumption was there's no fine-tuning here. It's all ordinary. We're going to discover the planets in our solar system are ordinary. And here we are at 7,500 planets, and it looks like that prediction did not pan out. Is that we really are seeing that the planets in our solar system are extraordinary. In fact, I remember back in the 1990s, the assumption was the only extraordinary planet in our solar system is Earth. We're now discovering that all 8 of them are extraordinary. And then we said, hey, we're now actually able to discover asteroid and comet belts around other stars. And the assumption was this will show that the asteroid and comet belts in our solar system are ordinary. And lo and behold, we're now discovering, it looks like they're extraordinary. Or the idea of trying to find a solar twin. The idea is we're going to find, thousands of stars just like the sun.
I really like what you're saying, because it's not getting hung up on here's this one argument that is compelling. Because I would, if I were a skeptic, I would respond to your comment. It's like, yeah, what you're saying about his planets is correct, but we also can't find our solar system looking around a star yet. So we don't know whether ours is, so there's a response I would have to that. But what you're looking at is, okay, yeah, we're out here dealing with the forefront of what we know at this point. Let's look at the history where the data is pretty much more established. That's effectively what I did in Escaping the Beginning. It's like, yeah, we're talking about quantum gravity, these things. We're at the forefront here where the science is unclear where we're going. But when you look at the history, the trend line seems to be wherever we say there wasn't a beginning, the universe keeps pushing us back. I think the same is true of the fine-tuning. Where we think we've solved the fine-tuning seems to just keep moving around and growing larger over time.
And the non-theists are progressively retreating into a smaller and smaller speculative space. So,
well, and I think there's a very real part where this isn't a one side's going to win. It's not going to ever be the case where the case for Christianity is just so compelling that people are going to have to walk away with it. I think God has always set it up so there's always a way for a person to say in a reasonable way that God doesn't
Jeff,
exist.
I've met a lot of non-Christian research scientists who basically said, I'm not going to become a Christian until all possible loopholes are gone. And it's like, well, for that to happen, we'd have to learn 100% of everything that's
true. Yeah.
of the universe. That'll never happen. So the non-theist has always got a place where they can retreat, where we say, hey, we don't have the evidence here to tell what's going on. And so if they're saying, you got to close all the doors before I believe, we're humans. We're constrained to the universe.
Absolutely,
we can't close all the doors.
Right.
But the very fact that the non-theist is progressively retreating should say something to that non-theist. I mean, if your worldview is correct, why are you always on the retreat? Why are you always being pushed back by the data?
I would be curious how... I think that is in general true of non-theism. I'm curious how a non-theist would address to that, because I'm pretty sure Christians, if you ask them, you're not going to get the same answer from any Christian on a specific question. So I would be curious. That's a different topic than today. But any final comments on the fine-tuning we've talked about here? I think it really is a strong case that we have for fine-tuning. It is one of those places we can say, I can be confident and hold on to this, even though the specific way the argument plays out, the universe really does look designed for us to be here.
Well, I would say this in closing. What we see in Job and Psalms, the more we learn about the universe, the more we learn about nature, the more we learn about creation, the more evidence we uncover for the supernatural handiwork of the Creator. That's going to continue, and Reasons to Believe is committed to demonstrate that biblical principle.
Amen. That's a great place to stop. Thanks for the discussion today, Hugh. It's been a good time. So I want to thank you for joining us on Stars, Cells, and God today. Also, encourage you to check out the discussion below, join in the comments, add your voice. Remember to like this video, subscribe for more content. We release new episodes of Stars, Cells, and God each Wednesday here and available on YouTube and on your favorite podcast app. Make sure to share this video with a friend, have a great conversation about it, and remember, the more we know about science, the more reasons we have to believe.